I would like to introduce you to A Good Man is Hard to Find by Flannery O'Connor. Most of the time, people begin with this story by Flannery. It is by far her most anthologized story, and yet if I was going to recommend you start with a story, it's not the one that I would recommend you start with. However, because it is often the only one that anyone teaches when they teach Flannery O'Connor, I'd like to begin with this story in order to really set you up to get the most that you can out of the story. So anyone familiar with Flannery O'Connor knows that you do not start Flannery O'Connor's story by looking for the moral of the story. As she told one teacher in a letter, do not treat the story like it's a research problem that you're trying to solve. Do not try to solve X plus Y equals Z. There is no Aesop fable at the end of a Flannery O'Connor story. Instead, there's an experience of the story, and as O'Connor herself said of her work, the meaning will continue to expand the more that you reflect upon it. So what we dive into here should not be the last time that you dive into a Flannery O'Connor story. As Bill Cook once said of Dante, once you finish reading the Divine Comedy, now you're ready to read the Divine Comedy. I think the same is true of Flannery O'Connor's work. Once you have finished reading A Good Man is Hard to Find, now you're ready to go read A Good Man is Hard to Find. The story begins with the grandmother didn't want to go to Florida. She wanted to visit some of her connections in East Tennessee, and she was seizing at every chance to change Bailey's mind. Bailey was the son she lived with, her only boy. So the story opens already with this dramatic tension, the grandmother, and that's the only name that she will have throughout, and this will be juxtaposed with the later character, the misfit, which is going to be introduced in paragraph 1, and it will be, as O'Connor has said, a duel between the misfit and the grandmother, and between specifically the ways that they see the world. When the story opens, the grandmother is standing there with her hand on her hip, a posture that is very proud, and she's standing above her son, Bailey, her only boy. She's treating him like an infant, her only boy, yet he is bald. He's a full man with 3 children of his own. And so we see from the beginning that the grandmother relates to people as though they should listen to her. See here, she says, read this. And it's a story about the misfit. She also claims, I wouldn't take my children in any direction with a criminal like that loose. But as you'll see when you read the story, she actually does take her children into the same realm as the criminal. And if it wasn't for her action, then the story and dramatic action that takes place would never have occurred. She ends that paragraph saying, I couldn't answer to my conscience if I did. That statement will be directly juxtaposed with the end of the story, when the misfit says, if Jesus did what he said, and he raised from the dead, then there's nothing that you can do but follow him. And if he didn't, then there's no pleasure but meanness, burning someone's house down or killing somebody. The if Jesus did this is what our choices are dependent upon. Whereas in this moment, the grandmother is saying, if I did this, I would have to answer to myself. It's a really tautological world that she inhabits. It's a very small world in which she is the god of her own tiny universe. As the story continues, you get introduced to a cast of characters, including Bailey's wife, who's only described as the mother, and her face is as bland as a cabbage. She wears a green handkerchief that looks like a little bunny ears. Again, it's through the grandmother's sight. It's indirect discourse given where we get to see through the eyes of the grandmother. And there's a dissonance between the grandmother's way of seeing things and the way things actually are. As we just mentioned, Bailey, her only boy, but he's a grown man. Later, we will see things about her conception of goodness. You will see her put on white gloves like she's a lady and a hat. So if there was an accident and her body is found by the side of the road, again, great foreshadowing because there will be an accident, her body will be found on the side of the road, everyone would know she was a lady. Her conception of good being a lady, being one with manners, and not really about the goodness, the virtue of being good. And she has to learn that lesson between her vision and the way things actually are throughout the story. They go on this road trip, and we get to know the grandmother's character a little bit more. When I teach this story, I often ask students to pay attention to 2 different things. Pay attention to 1, the number of deceptions that the grandmother puts forward. She is full of disguises. She is full of lies. She hides the cat, Pity Sing, in her lap. and later will lie to take the car off of its intended route and go off into the woods, which is where they will run into the misfit. She will also lie in telling different stories about the plantation house that had a secret panel, or about this beau that she courted, and it sounds like a very made-up story that's meant for humor. So throughout the story, she's a liar and a deceiver. And I think this is crucial for the title of the book, is A Good Man is Hard to Find, right? As though things are hidden and must be found. And rather than being someone who seeks or looks for what she's supposed to find, she is one of the people that is hiding things. She's deceiving, she's obscuring things. So she's a participant in the deception, in closing things off and not disclosing or revealing until an inopportune moment, and we'll get to that in the story. So one, I have my students look for those moments in which she's deceiving, disguising, hiding, or just flat out lying. And then also look for the number of times that she recalls things, remembers, misremembers, something reminded. The way that O'Connor uses that word becomes a pattern in the story until we get to a climactic moment of recall, and that word has become weighted with such significance that we get to unpack that moment fully. We've been signaled by that point. The story itself actually has a series of signs that the people see as they're driving down the road, and the signs are leading them to Red Sammy's barbecue. So you see the world's narrative being shown there, right? The world is full of these outlandishly explicit signs to make you into a consumer. It's teaching you one way of functioning. And then there's the more subtle or hidden signs that you have to find in order to really see things as they are. So O'Connor's playing with that in the story as well. So the road trip takes them to Red Sammy's. They've been following the signs. They get there, and Red Sammy and the grandmother have this nostalgic conversation about a fantastical past that did not exist. You know, in our day, we didn't have to lock the doors. In our day, nobody stole. There were better times, and O'Connor's really reflecting on this romanticization of, especially the South, really thinking about Gone with the Wind, this false version of how things used to be. In fact, the reason that a good man is so hard to find is because you can't look in the mirror and just find one. There just really isn't one. You have to admit first that a good man is hard to find because you yourself are not one. And so this is the mistake that we see in Red Sammy and in the grandmother, in which they think they are the good people and everything else is wrong with the world, that Europe is to blame, that others are the problem, and they don't see their own complicity or their own responsibility for the way things are in the world. As they go down this route the grandmother takes them on, she suddenly remembers, and she's too embarrassed to admit, that the plantation she was taking them to is in Tennessee and not in Georgia. And she has taken them off the right road down the wrong one. You get that literal and both figurative meaning to the right road. And she jumps. It upsets the cat, who jumps on the driver, on Bailey, and they crash the car. And when they do, another car approaches, a big black hearse-like automobile, and out steps three men, one of whom has a scholarly look. He has glasses on, and she says that his face appeared to be one that she had known her whole life and could not recall from where. Now, this is interesting because there should be lots of biblical resonance to that language, to seeing a face you cannot quite recall. I had a student who said it reminds him of the scene in the Old Testament in which the brothers don't recognize Joseph. But how could that be, he asked, because Joseph is a good figure and the misfit is a bad one. Another student said it reminded her of when Christ is walking and discipling the disciples along the road to Emmaus, and they don't recognize him, though he seems familiar to them. I think of the passage in James in which it says, you look at your face and walk away and forget what it is that you look like. I think all of those biblical resonances are supposed to be in the image. The grandmother should see the misfit and literally be able to recall him because she just saw his picture in the newspaper, which she will literally recall him. But also there's a figurative sense in which she should recognize in his face not only her own complicity for who he is, her guilt as a person for participating in sin and causing it to breed and to fester in the world that she lives in and passing it down to the next generation, but also she should see in him the face of Christ, or Joseph, the face of goodness, the face that Christ can reflect through. And she doesn't recognize any of those things. In fact, she calls out the misfit, and she recognizes him, and thus the misfit decides, because I'm a serial killer and now you've called me out, I have to kill you. And so he begins to take the family off into the woods to shoot them. She then calls him out the way she did Red Sammy. And the grandmother says, "You're a good man, you're a good man." Well, how is she defining goodness? She's defining it in the same way that she defined herself as a lady, by putting on the right clothes, by having good blood, by having good Southern manners. And this is dissembling, right? This is not true goodness. This is a facade of goodness. And he lacks the facade entirely. He doesn't actually have a shirt on because he has yet to kill somebody who could give him a shirt. He's wearing jeans that are too tight because as a convict, he buried his clothes. He couldn't wear his prison uniform and run around. But he's wearing tights that he took off another body. He says he borrowed these from somebody, right? And he will eventually put Bailey's shirt on, which is a very outlandish, it's a yellow shirt with blue parrots on it. And in that moment, when he does that, the grandmother sees him and sees her son Bailey in him, both literally in that shirt, but as we'll mention in a second, figuratively as well. The misfit says that he calls himself that because he cannot fit all what he done wrong in the world with the punishment he received. We're not sure whether or not he did commit a crime and that's how he ended up in jail, or whether or not he was an innocent victim of an unjust system. Either way, he sees that he doesn't deserve punishment. Like manner, the grandmother doesn't see that she does not deserve some of the blessings and graces that she has received. What she would deserve is punishment, right? Because all are guilty before God. Not one of us is sinless. And yet we also are not deserving of the grace we have received from Christ dying on the cross. So both of them should recognize their utter badness and that they should deserve punishment and yet have received grace. So neither of them are seeing the world correctly, neither the grandmother or the misfit. And yet in this moment, they bring up Jesus. The grandmother at first begins saying his name as though it is a prayer, but really it sounds like a curse. And the misfit says that he blames Jesus. Jesus, the only one that ever raised the dead, and he shouldn't have done it. Jesus thrown everything off balance. And that's where we get that famous either or. If Jesus did it, then there's nothing for you to do but throw away everything and follow him. And if he didn't, then there's no pleasure but meanness. And that's the crux of the story. And when the grandmother hears that moment, that moment of grace offered to her in this either or, she says, maybe he didn't raise the dead. And it's the first time we see her not knowing what she said, the narrator observes. It's the first time that she doesn't stand above everyone, knowing what she wants to do, knowing what's right, being able to say who's good and who's not. She questions, maybe he did or maybe he didn't. And in that questioning second, she has grace offered to her. And she looks at the misfit and she says, why? You're one of my own children. She's both recognizing that she's guilty for his sins. She's responsible for the sin being in the world. She's responsible for all the ways maybe the system was unjust and hurt him. She's responsible for leading them all there. It's her moment of confession, but it's also recognizing you're one of my children. And there's this ownership here that is not Bailey, my only boy, but I love you and that makes you related to me, and that there is something connecting between the two of them. And it's this recognition that is different than when she recognized him and said, you're the misfit. And he was all pleased with himself, like, oh, you recognize me from the paper? Instead, it was, wait, you just called me by my real name? I'm one of your children? And that identity that he wanted nothing to do with, the identity to be one of the children, he shoots her 3 times in the chest. And we see a change in her disposition as well as she falls, legs crossed in the gutter or in the ditch. She's descended. She looks up at the sun in the cloudless sky and is smiling. And we don't know whether or not she had a transformation, and we don't know whether the misfit did, but there seems to be signs for both. He takes off his glasses, wipes them clean, either from tears or from blood, and says, she would have been a good woman if there'd been somebody to shoot her every day of her life. And while the grandmother, whether or not the grandmother or the misfit actually change, we as readers have the opportunity to say, I'm going to change. I'm going to throw away everything and follow him.